The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is Wednesday. It's the 9th of September. You're here at Lunch and Learn. Today we have a guest speaker, Dr. Roulette Smith. I first got to know of his work during the ISNR conference that was held as a virtual conference this year. And he gave a beautiful talk on the topic you see here on your screens about stress and stress-activated viruses. And I was so impressed with the talk that afterwards they give you a little room you can all go to and then ask questions. So he and myself and several others sat in that room, and then we chatted for like another whole hour. So I'm going to let him give you a little bit of background on himself. That I'm wasting any time with my talking about Dr. Smith here, but he's brilliant in what he has to say, and I'm very fortunate that we were able to get him here. So, Roulette, without any further delay, it's all yours.
Okay, you did you or did you not send out the succinct summary about my background?
They have all that. They have that background.
Okay, yep. So I don't need to go through my background at Stanford. My work on computer assisted instruction led to the development of computerized training. And in fact, this is an ideal time for seeing how it works, given the pandemic that we're now dealing with. What I want to talk about today, though, is stress and stress-activated viruses in public health, mental health, and anticipatory pathology. The anticipatory pathology is something you've probably not heard of, but what I'm going to be saying is that the stress-activated viruses particularly can give rise to pathologies immediately or not, sometimes in the distant future, sometimes even 20 or 30 or 40 years in the distant future. You have here in the first slide a way of reaching me at either of these email addresses, although I prefer to receive messages at the Humanized Technologies site, NAJMS. NAJMS means nothing. I tried to just choose a set of 5 characters that would get through spam filters. So why do we want to discuss stress now? I want you to think about this because there are a confluence of a number of events going on right now. We have this worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. We have what some of you may have seen or heard of. It's being connoted MIS-C for the Kawasaki-like disorders in youngsters. There's a lot of stress associated with the structural and systemic racism following George Floyd's death and the mass demonstrations. There's stresses associated with the unanticipated economic upheaval right now, including the equity issues associated with essential versus non-essential peoples. There are stresses associated with different minorities for many different reasons, possibly being provoked by the politics that are going on. And what I'm going to add to this is something that I'm sure you hadn't really thought about, but there's a term that we sometimes hear used. It's called common sense. What you may not know is that I've spent the last 30 years studying common sense. I got interested in common sense in 1985 because there were a group of young kids I was volunteering in a elementary school teaching a math lab, and there was students who couldn't get certain kinds of they made certain kinds of mistakes. And when you're a mathematician, errors are just as important as the correct answers, and the errors tell you things. But these kids made errors that were just unexplainable. And so I mentioned it to the school librarian, and she said, these kids make the same kinds of errors in reading instead of math. And I asked her to give me some examples. Well, I won't do that here, but she did show me that they made mistakes in reading. And so I mentioned it to the school principal. This was in Sunnyvale, California in 1985. And the principal said, why don't you have a parent-teacher conference and we'll talk about this. And I noticed that at the parent-teacher conference that all of the parents were very negative. They just couldn't say anything positive. So I then realized that common sense may have a much more grounded scholarly grounding, and I began studying it. But I also realized that there are two what I call types of psychoviruses. These are communication styles, but they're transmissible and infectious. One of them is the negativism. I call it TN, transmissible negativism. And the other is BO, blaming others. And you see transmissible negativism, especially in people, in the parents of people who don't have common sense or have disorders in common sense. And you see blaming others occurring in some ways associated with common sense disorders. And then the last thing I'm going to be talking about today, or what I'm really working towards, is what I call unanticipated consequences of stress-activated viruses. Back in if you saw my succinct background, I taught at the University of California at Santa Barbara for 5 years, and I, through some strange happenstance, had to make a decision to go to medical school. And while in medical school, I learned about viruses because I knew nothing about viruses before then. But I had a friend named Paola Barbieri, became a well-known psychologist. She was a graduate student at Stanford then, who had Hodgkin's lymphoma. And no one knew what the cause of Hodgkin's lymphoma was, but I had a reason to believe, as a result of a first year of medical training, that the Epstein-Barr virus was its cause. And so Stanford had the expert on Hodgkin's disease there, a fellow named Henry Kaplan. And he said, no way. He said, Epstein-Barr virus is a common virus, and a common virus can't cause an uncommon disease. But that's how I got started on this. At the time, in the 70s and 80s, there were maybe 5 or 6, less than 10 diseases associated with EBV. Burkitt's lymphoma, nasopharyngeal carcinoma. I added Hodgkin's lymphoma. 4 or 5. And then I wrote a paper that predicted or anticipated AIDS. And in the AIDS period, there was Kaposi sarcoma. And Kaposi sarcoma had characteristics of these gamma herpes viruses. So moving forward, the thing that's interesting about Epstein-Barr and the gamma herpes viruses, or at least some of them, is they're actively involved in evolution. And the reason for talking about this now is that we have so many stresses coming together, a confluence of them is the word I use, that we need to start thinking about what are going to be the long-term consequences. And so this slide here is just to remind you that evolution has many different causes, or the etiology of evolution is stimulated by several things: climate and atmosphere, terrain, tectonic plate movements, competition in living forms, mobility and utility. The medical community focuses on fight and flight issues that are associated with stress. Of course, genetic variation is a consequence of evolution. We have enhancers like in hormones and change agents such as pathogens. The classic pathogens that we need to think about is the pathogen that causes malaria, because what you'll see is that there are a whole host of diseases. They're called hemoglobinopathies. Sickle cell anemia, Sickle's trait, the thalassemias, the alpha and beta thalassemias. All of these hemoglobinopathies appear to have been caused by some feature of the Epstein-Barr virus that can cause mutations that then have some selective advantage. I'm adding to this longevity and senescence because of the work on telomeres and mitochondrial mitophagy, or autophagy as it's called, how the cells turn over, and then the psychoviruses at the end. And this is in contrast to what you typically hear of as memes. We're not talking about memes, we're talking about forms of communications that are definitely transmissible, infectious, and can cause consequences. And I'm going to say it here, but I have not published it yet. I am working on publishing it. The reason this is important in this discussion right now is that it appears to me that the evolution of the COVID-19 virus in Wuhan, or maybe before Wuhan, is because of some stress-activated issues. Yes, it may have some relationship to the bat, but it is the stress activation issues that are contributing to its evolution. And I'm going to couch this in terms of chaos theory. And it's the political chaos that has been, we've seen over the last at least 3 or 4 years that has contributed to this evolution. The COVID-19 pandemic, who are at risk? Travelers, obviously, planes, trains, ships. Many of you probably realize that the earliest cases of COVID were on ships. The commercial ships, passenger ships, off of Japan and off of the California, other places where some of the earliest cases were identified. But what is not often mentioned is that COVID was, in retrospect, discovered on military vessels going back to before December. So that's one of the reasons that I'm saying that the chaos issues may be far more important than focusing on Wuhan and the Trump notion of the China virus. I think it's really offensive, in fact, to even call it a China virus. Homeless healthcare workers, they're going to be at risk because they're the first line defense. And those people didn't know about what they're dealing with. When you're dealing with a new virus, you just can't know what the consequences are. Well, homeless persons, these persons are living under bridges and in tents and in encampments and other places. If the virus infects one of them, it can spread very quickly. Persons living in senior housing units, senior citizen housing units. At least here in California, that's a really big issue. And I think it's become a big issue in New York State and several other places. Prisons and detention centers. In California, we have to have moved around prisoners because of the outbreaks in several of the prisons, but that in fact contributes to the further spread of the viruses. So some of the prisons now are releasing people under supervised custody situations. Selective persons with intellectual disabilities. I don't want to name any specific disabilities because that will tend to probably misdirect the attention, but I can tell you that in the literature that I cited in the abstracts, there were, I think, 13 or more pages. I include a number of the persons who develop COVID with the intellectual disabilities. And so what is at issue here is whether those intellectual disabilities set them up for specific risks, just as, let's say, a specific risk of obesity or ACE2 receptors and whatnot. We don't know the answer to that yet. but I can provide some speculation as to why that may be the case. Persons who do not honor and observe the use of face masks and social distancing and whatnot. Just the last few days, there's been a result of a study from the Sturgis motorcycle there was a big motorcycle rally in Sturgis, I think it's North or South Dakota, one of the places. But original testing showed that there were about 300 persons who were there, and they've been able to track those to the various states, Minnesota and several other states. But they're projecting it's going to be over 200,000 persons that are becoming infected with the COVID virus as a result of that enclave of motorcyclists not using face masks and such. In fact, it will be interesting to see if there are any large outbreak of COVID cases associated with the Republican convention at the White House, because people were sitting very closely and very few people had face masks. I mentioned the comorbidities like the ACE receptors associated with diabetes, obesity, diabetes, and there are several other comorbidities at this time. Subpopulations associated with aberrant leadership. We can look at the Philippines, we can look at Brazil, we can look at the United States. The leaders in these countries have given rise to, and the Soviet Union, have given rise to excess numbers of cases as compared to France, Germany, Italy, New Zealand, Australia. It is notable how aberrant leadership contributes to the spread. Workers in crowded facilities lacking protective personal equipment. In California here, and in Iowa and other places where they have farm workers and meat packers in Georgia and other places, they have excess numbers of cases, partly because the agricultural industry and the meat processing industries have not provided adequate protective equipment. There is some evidence that persons with type A positive blood may be more severe than with persons with type O blood. We're not understanding that fully yet. I could give you all kinds of charts and things. The government tends to cite the Johns Hopkins report, but there are other trackers and data, and rather than spending a lot of time talking about each of them selectively, I've just made this slide and I've given you linkages that you can go to if you're interested in race and ethnicity, if you're looking at essential versus non-essential persons, if you're interested in health workers as opposed to non-health workers, if you're interested in geographic location. So that's just a resource for you rather than spending a lot of time on talking about it. What are the potential mental health consequences? So since many of you are working in mental health and some public health areas, I listed out here 15 mental health consequences associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the George Floyd inspired racial systemic racism issues and other things all add to this list. The one that I added in the slide that I didn't talk about at the ISNR conference is the eating disorders, or actually two of them, gun violence and eating disorders. At the conference there, I listed the first 13. So you're having the benefit with this slide showing gun violence has increased significantly in some cities, and eating disorders has increased significantly as a result of this confluence of stress-activated issues. For those of you who are physicians, persons working in anatomy and biological sciences, all I've done here is on this slide is just to remind you that stress can change various physical structures in the brain and the consequences of physical structures such as memory, spatial memory and whatnot. And it may increase the risks for mental illness. So rather than specifically talking about, because of the time limitations, I won't go through each of these, although we can answer questions at the end. I mentioned that I began my work on common sense in 1985. And since then, I've studied common sense in almost all animals, well, I can't say all, but many animals throughout the world. We call that herd sense because it's herd behavior. But for our purposes, common sense is defined as core nurturance within a group, herd, or culture, and on an organizational institution. The important point is that common sense is relevant because of how the herd comes together and coalesces and falls behind either some leader or some commonly perceived interests. And the reason this is extremely important in this particular stressful set of situations is because of the confusion that's being, and misinformation that's being dispersed about social distancing, face masking. People tend to think that they have an absolute right to make their own decisions, not realizing that they're a part of a herd, a part of a culture, and the world is not just for them, it is for them and others. And so that's why the common sense issues comes in here. But it comes in another way. I spent at least 5 years studying common sense in Germany, World War II Germany. I just bought a house in Wiesbaden and did some ethnographic studies of how Germany put itself back together. As you may recall, lots of German men lost their lives in the Second World War. And since it was a paternal, patriarchal society, the common sense had to be reestablished by the women. They were called the Traumafrauen, the rebel women. So you have now an interesting situation that in World War II Germany, common sense was reestablished by women instead of men. And it's interesting to note how it works. In fact, in today's news, they're talking about how on Sundays there's a law that says you can't cut your lawn and you can't make noise and whatnot. Some of those things are direct consequences of World War II German common sense put together by the women. But what is also interesting is that if you look at the people who other people who were involved in the World War II, you had the Jewish people, many of them went to Israel, others of them went to South America, some of them came to the United States. So there are different numbers, the diaspora. But what is interesting is that the common sense in those different places, Jewish common sense differs in each of the places. That's an interesting way to look at the problem. So what we need to think about in terms of this specific set of stressful situations is how are things going to change as a consequence of the length of this COVID situation and other stressful situations, and the the fallout is the word I would use, how it's going to affect immigrants, how it's going to affect blacks and other minorities, how it's going to affect the wealthy versus the various independent distributions of peoples. And I mentioned earlier the notion of the psychoviruses. This is particularly interesting because you have, it's interesting, when I was a child, I'm now 78 years old. When I was a child, there were only 3 or maybe 4 channels for communication: ABC, CBS, and NBC. Now we have hundreds, if not almost thousands of them. Fox, for example, is well known for spreading misinformation. And I don't want to necessarily blame Fox for it, but what we see is that we have a present administration that is just liberally lies and liberally speaks untruth and liberally fails to follow scientific principles and liberally makes claims that are absolutely outrageous. For example, right now we're being told that there'll be a vaccine before November 3rd. There will be a vaccine. In fact, in the Oxford study today, there's a person who's developed transverse myelitis, which is a hugely problematic finding. It's like in some of the early influenza vaccines, they discovered the progressive Guillain-Barré types of syndrome. So we're not going to see a vaccine. And I will say something even further. The ability of the Epstein-Barr virus to cause mutations is going to create phenomenal challenges for any vaccine. You may have one temporarily that will may be present at the end of this year or early next year, but it will not be long-lived. This is just the same slide that you just saw, but I just put the wording on common sense in one slide. And this is the 2 slides ago, the same thing that you saw there. And again, I'm focusing on 2 psychoviruses. I'm sure there are many, but I first focused on transmissible negativism because of its association with common sense. And by the way, the mechanism by which I believe, I think there's strong evidence for how this works. Common sense really develops right around the time of the terrible twos. A child, roughly 2 years old, they do something and the parent says, no, don't do that, don't do this, just what have you. But after a period of time, their no should revert to yes, and sometimes no. But the persons who are the transmissible negativism, who transmit these transmissible negative viruses, get stuck in a no phase, and then the child develops no common sense. So I'm hoping that the Nobel Committee, out of Norway, will at some point give us a Nobel Prize on people who have disorders in common sense, just to show the difference between good common sense and persons who have disorders in common sense. I will say also, for those of you who may take an interest in this, for example, if you're a school teacher, the class clowns are almost always the persons who either have some intellectual disability or who have some problems with common sense. And the clowning then is a way to, the person uses to, it's a defense mechanism that they use to redirect attention from their problems. You have this with other disorders too, dyslexia and whatnot. But the point is that if you take time and focus on people who are comedians and misdirect attention sometimes it tells you important information. And when I did my first study of this back in the mid-1980s, I asked myself, were there any really important people who had disorders in common sense? Well, the first one I identified was I would think of it, Fat Albert, Bill Cosby. The Fat Albert character was an example of his negativism, and he went on to, of course, have the Cosby program, which was meant to be an excellent characterization of life in the Black and minority community. But you can also see that he ended up in prison because of his failures in common sense. Margaret Thatcher was another person who lacked common sense back in the 80s when I started thinking about it. Nancy Reagan, her just say no. And probably the most interesting one of all is Roald Dahl, the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the person who developed the children's literature. If you look back at his history, biography, you'll see that there was a lot of negativism in his life. And he's given us creatively lots of important literature, but he also had a disorder in common sense. Critically unanswered questions. Well, I'm focusing originally on the youngsters with multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, because when I first got started on my research on Epstein-Barr virus in the late 70s and early 80s, it came about for two reasons. There was a set of papers by a woman named Joan Stites at Yale, where she did some really excellent work on purifying EBV, small RNAs and EBV genes. And what was remarkable is that the SM antigen was associated with lupus, the LA antigen was associated with Sjogren's disease. There were several others that were associated with autoimmune diseases. And so I asked the question in myself, is it possible that what Epstein-Barr virus does is it generates a mistranslation or mistranscription of a host gene, and then the body, the host then doesn't recognize it and produces an autoimmune response. So at that time, there were maybe 8 or 10 diseases, autoimmune diseases associated with, well, actually there were 3 or 4 associated with Epstein-Barr. And as a result of my work with my student, who was the co-inventor of the Netscape browser, when it came out in 1997, 98, and then subsequently with the Google browser, I realized that if you Google for EBV and you make a list of them, there were 192 diseases in 2002 that I reported, and they're now probably over 1,000. So the question is, because we know that Kawasaki disease and I'm blanking out on the term of the other Japanese disease, starts with an H. Both of those were clearly associated with Epstein-Barr, although they didn't know it at the time when the diseases were discovered. And so when I saw the evidence of the MISC youngsters, the question is the COVID virus itself causing the disease, or is their disease being developed because of some other mechanism, for 2 reasons. One, normally EBV is transmitted in a equatorial zone bounded by the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. That's where EBV is most prevalent. And in that region, EBV is transmitted usually as a result of the first act of kissing, age 18, 19, 20, when you have a romantic relationship. That's why you have mononucleosis being called kissing disease. Well, if EBV is getting in these kids, either the whole virus or some of those particles that Joan Seitz discovered back in the late 70s, early 80s, we need to make a distinction between hugging and kissing, because normally you hug your kids, but you don't necessarily go around kissing them. And it could be that when a kid's relative, a parent, or whatever, a grandparent, is taught, they learn that the relative is COVID positive and they can't visit them and they die. There may be kissing that goes on, the virus is transmitted to the kids, and the stress associated with the transmission of the virus and or its subparticles then can give rise to this Kawasaki-like autoimmune presentation. So that's the big issue that I want people to start reflecting on, and that's going to be associated with many different long-term anticipatory pathologies that I mentioned earlier. We don't know what all the consequences are going to be at this particular time. We do know, and I have a number of papers now that show that COVID-19 is not in a number of these kids. And in at least 50% of the kids that have been reported, they don't find the virus itself. Sometimes they do, but in 50% of the kids, they don't find the virus. So I'm on a mission to have researchers look to see if they find any evidence, not only of EBV, but EBV antigens. And the most interesting possibility is a consequence, which is called acid Labial Alpha interferon. That, for people who worked in the HIV and AIDS area, they remember that, you will remember that acid Labial Alpha interferon was one of the molecules that was frequently found in clinical presentation. So what this slide here does is it shows you the mechanism of going from a host gene. This is the transcription phase, and then it could be translation. So there could be errors here and there could be errors here. And so you may have two types of error molecules, and these error molecules will invoke some kind of autoimmune response. But some of those molecules may then go on to develop long-term consequences. When I first met David Cantor in Dallas, Texas, back in the early 2000s, I pointed out that every case of autism that I have studied shows that the mother of the autistic child was under some stress during her pregnancy, and she might have produced these molecules and they were transmitted to the offspring. They could be aberrant molecules in the offspring, and so the autistic and other spectrum consequences may come along at some later stage in the child's development, age 2, 3, 5, whatever, the social abnormalities and intellectual abnormalities or excess skills like Asperger's persons. So I made two distinctions. If this is an Epstein-Barr virus, you have two possibilities. One is the production of molecules, and the other is the production of what I call autovirulence. But the autotoxins are the particles that are released and then can go on and cause other diseases. And I make the claim that two of those kinds of molecules are particularly interesting. The ones that Stan Frusner called prions, that he got the Nobel Prize for, but the tauopathies and others could well have been an evolutionary outshoot of outgrowth of the Epstein-Barr virus. Autovirulence is where one of these Epstein-Barr virus small RNAs, possibly packaged in a protein, infects a cell, and then it produces abnormal consequences, sometimes other autovariants and sometimes prognathous molecules, abnormal molecules, and those can go on and cause these anticipatory pathologies. So thus far, I've said two things to you. I've said you have normal stresses that have evolved to create many different possibilities, but I've also been saying to you that there are certain viruses that have been evolved to further evolve or to contribute to the further evolution of different species. And in making that claim, I hope you'll keep in mind that in those last two slides on autotoxins and autovirions, I hope that at some point along we have the paleontologists and the medical anthropologists go and see if they can find evidence of these autotoxins and autovirions so that we can in fact make firm inferences about how the hemoglobinopathies, for example, have evolved. So the critical unimportant questions are whether these persons are COVID possible. I've said that only roughly 50% of them are. Whether they're COVID negative, roughly 30 to 40% are. Are there reports of autoimmune findings? I have not found anyone who's been able to give me any answer to that question. And if you look at the distribution of Epstein-Barr virus throughout the globe, throughout the planet Earth, you see that in the northern climes and southern climes, in Norway, Sweden, Scandinavian countries, the prevalence of EBV is much less, and that's why you have much fewer instances of EBV associated with disorders. And the same thing for the southern climes in South Africa, Cape Horn, New Zealand, Tasmania. In summary, and I think we'll have about 10 minutes left to answer any questions. I'm saying here that stress, along with social, physical, environmental, political, and molecular biological factors involving the pandemic, the demonstrations, the structural racism, all these things come together and are contributing to what we now have is an almost untenable situation. And I will add that when you have these aberrant leaders, Donald Trump, Duterte, Erdogan, the fellows in North Sudan and South Sudan, and others, Bolsonaro, they add to the complications associated with this spread, either through their transmissible negativism, they're blaming others, and other considerations. I've only briefly mentioned here vaccines, and I didn't want to spend too much time because I didn't want to spend too much time scaring off the possibility of any hope for this warp speed project to pay off, although today it was reported that transverse myelitis, which is just as severe as the Guillain-Barré was during the development of the influenza vaccines, these are very troubling developments. This is a slide from David Ho, and I added it at the very last day of the ISNR conference, and it's now added for you. David Ho made a really crucial observation here. I'm sorry I can't enlarge this, I don't know how to do that yet. What he basically is saying is when you don't have a fully coordinated program, you end up getting multiple outbreaks, and your possibility of getting this set of the consequences of all these stress-related events under control gets spread out over a long period of time and may in fact continue long into the future. So what he was essentially saying is that if you recognize and lock down initially and develop a timeline where everything is under control with a national policy in whatever country, as Ardern did in New Zealand, and to some extent happened in France, Germany, and Italy. Things were under control because there was a much better control policy. And I think that's the last slide. So you can unmute the microphones, and I'll take questions. Let's see, I don't need to leave the slides there.
Okay, Roulette, we're unmuting folks now, but he has to go down and do it one by one. It may just be a minute or so before
No, take your time. I'm going to see if I can pull up here.
Okay, all right.
I'm connected to the... Yeah, now I got the... I don't see any faces, but that's okay.
No, you won't. You don't. No one's on camera.
Okay.
It's not like Zoom was. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we should be getting folks unmuted. Any questions?
I heard Michael say something, but it sounded like his volume was down.
I choked.
Oh.
I do have a question. Thanks again for this pandemic tour de force. There was a recent, I think it was an opinion piece in the New York Times about whether face masks were, by reducing and gradually introducing a small viral load to those who wear them, is that in effect doing some sort of immunization if you wear the masks?
There have been several reports. There have been both mathematical modeling, and there have been actual clinical studies. There are 2 or 3 kinds of issues. There's the aerosolization of the particles, and that's why you don't want to be in a small environment, in a small enclosed environment. And that's why face masks, as well as possible face shields, can be very important, especially in these highly enclosed places like in a barber shop or tailor shop or cleansing place. We don't know all of the results on the aerosolization, but if you were provided the abstract and the 13 pages of resources that I assembled there, in one section, I talk about the different models of face masking and whatnot, and they provide all of the different models and what's known, both laboratory-wise and otherwise. The one most important thing that has not been fully emphasized is these people who wear gaiters, the little things that they put around their neck. Those are not very good protectors of the spread, and they're not very good protectors of spreading or of preventing the spread. They look good, they're good for modeling and whatnot, but they're absolutely unsafe. Gaiters is G-A-I-T-E-R. It's the things you see people pulling around their neck.
Yeah, almost look like a piece of clothing for those that haven't seen them. It's just like basically if you imagine a tube, a cloth tube that you pull over your head and it surrounds your neck, and then you can pull it up to go over your mouth and chin, and the base of it's still sort of at the base of your neck. That's interesting to know because a lot of women like them because they're sort of fashionable.
Fashionable,
yes.
Yeah. My father was a designer and a tailor, and so that's why I got interested in them. But when I saw and again, that paper is in the citation is in my references there. That was a real surprise to me. And some people have been making face masks. Probably the best ones are the N95s, of course, and then the second best are the little blue three-folds that you can get.
Yeah, I would imagine the people that just wear a bandana folded in half, where you have it over the nose and the triangles coming down in front of the face, is
right.
not highly effective either. Yeah.
Right. But this is going to be one of the long-term common sense issues that I want to look into is if I can get enough data to show how masking of different forms is associated with different forms of common sense, and the cultural clash in common sense where people think that they are entitled to behave in the way they want. We want to be able to show that there's a cost associated with that. That was the reason for my comment about the Nobel Prize in economics. There are 3 Nobel Prizes to be awarded based on this pandemic, for those of you who are interested in Nobels. One of them is the Nobel Prize based on the economics of common sense and disorders in common sense. A second prize is, I think, would be a chemistry prize, would be to show how the Epstein-Barr virus produces these mutations that then go on and cause anticipatory pathologies, Burkitt syndrome and all the others that we've seen. And then the third prize is one in medicine, physiology of medicine, associated with the specific sets of diseases that perhaps autoimmune diseases, for example, like the MISC, to be able to demonstrate that concretely.
Vic, did you have a question?
Yeah, can I just
Please.
compliment? I would like to just compliment our guest speaker for this wise and holistic perception of both the microscopic and macroscopic view of not only on 3 levels: the intrapersonal and the extrapersonal, and most importantly, the interpersonal, because you've really shared deeply your life's work. And so for so many years of dedicated science, this is a tremendous gift that you were passing on. So
well,
I want to thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment there. I got in trouble in medical school because I anticipated a disease we now call HIV and AIDS. The medical dean, associate dean, said no medical student should go around the world talking about disease. When the 2002 paper came out where I met David Cantor, I made the claim then that the studies on vaccines causing autisms were wrong, and I showed the actual mechanism, how Epstein-Barr is the likely cause of all of those disorders. And in the references in my citations, I also include evidence that male homosexual persons, and possibly females, lesbians, are associated with changes that the Epstein-Barr virus can cause on the X chromosome in the mothers. So these persons are inclined to their, or destined to their gender differences and whatnot. And I haven't gotten to the point of talking about this in the context of religion, but we now really need to stop and think about the role of religion, churches, and whatnot, and how there may need to be various teachings to allow for respect for the different forms of evolution, the different evolved people that we have, rather than gay, lesbian types of things, or the issues about a woman's right to choose, or the different things, genital mutilations and stuff. I don't, of course, didn't talk about that here, but I do think that the one important political, intrapersonal, and interpolitical comment is that I'm willing to bet that chaos theory is going to show that this COVID-19 pandemic was caused by our president of the United States, and the aberrant relationship he developed with the Chinese. But the virus has probably been around before that. In fact, there's some evidence that it was there on some of the military ships. And I don't know that that was transmitted in any way to China. But the point is, this chaos theory is going to come into play. So when you talk about the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and other, the political, I think, should also be added.
Absolutely. Our understanding of psychosis and post-structural theory may also contribute to the chaos theory. Thank you again for your contribution.
Yeah. By the way, I emphasized this at the ISNR conference, but many of you deal with stress abatement and management techniques. And I think that this is the area where you're in a position to really make some marvelous contributions, because we're dealing now with probably the most stressful event in the last 100, if not hundreds of years, with all these things coming along. And that was the reason that I cited the many different 15 as examples of stress-related issues. So people like yourselves who can find ways to intervene and manage stress and anxiety, suicide, and whatnot, this is where you come into the picture.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I know your time is valuable, and we're very fortunate.
I can stand around more if anyone has any other questions.
We will probably need to wrap this up, but at some point in time, if you want to have an open discussion, let me talk about that with Rich. We might just have you back for like a, just open discussion on this. Is a complex topic, as Vic was pointing out. So I think what we'll do for today is we will wind this down, and then I will see if people are interested in that, and we can try to get you back.
Yeah, I think you said this will be available on YouTube.
Yes, I'll email you as soon as it goes up. Usually the staff here will take about a week before they go over, make sure there's no glitches in it, make sure the sound is good. It gets posted up on YouTube, and I will send you that link as soon as it's posted.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Roulette. It's just great talk.
I really appreciate your both, one, letting me do this, and two, that you worked with me to get this computer to work. Because although I have a PhD in basically artificial intelligence, its educational applications, the world has changed so rapidly in terms of apps and whatnot, and I just didn't know how to manipulate my own computer until we worked these things.
Well, you and I got it to work, and it was well worth it, and I'm so glad you were able to, be here today, and we thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, we'll see you Friday. Bye-bye.